He took everything from her, her daughter, her sister, her faith in love. But he never realized when he crossed the line. And by the time the truth came out, it was already too late. Retribution didn't scream. It smiled. In the warm southern spring of 2011, the Hunter family lived in a quiet suburb of Savannah, Georgia, where oak trees draped in Spanish moss lined the streets and the air always smelled faintly of salt from the nearby coast. Their home, a modest but elegant two-story house with a wide porch and white shutters, stood as a testament to everything they had built together over the past 8 years. Inside those walls, love wasn't just spoken, it was lived. Marcus Hunter, 38, was a self-made man who owned a thriving auto repair business. His hands bore the calluses of hard work, but his eyes softened every time he looked at his family. He had built the business from the ground up, pouring his youth into long hours and grease-stained overalls. By the time he reached his late 30s, his shop was one of the most respected in Savannah. Vanessa, his wife, was a striking woman with a sharp mind and steady hands. At 36, she had already achieved what many in her field only dreamed of. A board-certified hematologist, she had recently opened her own private clinic, treating patients with blood disorders and earning the quiet admiration of colleagues and patients alike. She carried herself with dignity, always in a pressed lab coat, her voice calm, her manner exact. Her success never created distance between her and Marcus. Instead, it formed a kind of mutual reverence. They respected one another deeply, each proud of the other's accomplishments. But the real light of their lives was Liana, their 6-year-old daughter. With curls that bounced when she laughed and a voice that sang more than it spoke, Liana filled every room with an effortless joy. She adored storybooks and ladybugs, often chasing the latter through the backyard while Vanessa sat on the steps with a cup of tea, watching her with an absent smile. Marcus would join them in the evenings, his arms outstretched, letting Liana run full speed into his chest before lifting her high above his head. It was a ritual that never got old. Weekdays followed a rhythm of comfort. Vanessa left early for her clinic, often before sunrise, and Marcus handled the morning routine with Liana, packing lunches, tying shoes, walking her to the bus stop. In the afternoons, Vanessa would return in time to help with homework, while Marcus cooked dinner and tinkered with small projects in the garage. Evenings were sacred. They read books together on the couch, took family walks around the neighborhood, and said goodnight with kisses and whispered promises for tomorrow. Weekends brought even more delight, trips to the farmer's market, barbecues in the backyard, spontaneous drives to the beach. Their marriage was not perfect, but it was strong. Disagreements did occur, about work hours, about parenting decisions, but they always ended in quiet resolutions, mutual understanding, and laughter that made everything feel solvable. Vanessa had a temper, but it cooled quickly. Marcus was slow to speak in arguments, but always thoughtful in his response. They were not just partners, they were allies. Friends admired them, often pointing to their relationship as something to aspire to. Vanessa's colleagues would comment on how lucky she was, while Marcus's friends joked that he had married up. But beneath the compliments lay a genuine truth: they were happy. They had built something rare, an honest life filled with love, ambition, and purpose. On birthdays, the house would fill with balloons and music. Vanessa decorated the living room with streamers while Marcus grilled hot dogs and burgers for the neighbors. Liana, in her princess dresses, would twirl around the yard, her laughter echoing through the trees. On Christmas mornings, they opened presents in pajamas, sipping hot cocoa and taking pictures no one would ever delete. On Sunday afternoons, they napped together, the house filled with the soft buzz of the ceiling fan and the hum of contentment. They were not wealthy in the extravagant sense, but they lived without want. Their bank accounts were healthy, their schedules full, their hearts even fuller. The clinic thrived, the business prospered, and Liana was growing into a curious, kind-hearted child. Life was a carefully composed harmony, and they played their roles with grace. No one, not even the most observant visitor, could have sensed what lay ahead. There were no warnings in the wind, no shadows in the sunlight that streamed through their windows each morning. The Hunter family, as they existed in that golden year, seemed untouchable, rooted in love, grounded in mutual respect, and wrapped in the innocence of a little girl's laughter. Their house stood proudly on its quiet street, a place where love had taken root, blossomed, and flourished. And in that moment, before time would unravel it all, that love was enough. The spring of 2013 arrived in Savannah cloaked in warmth and blooms. The azaleas in the Hunter family's yard exploded into shades of pink and white, and the air carried the heavy scent of magnolias. The days stretched longer, golden with promise. Life seemed to continue in rhythm, untouched by anything darker than an occasional storm. That year, they decided to take a weekend drive to a small lake 2 hours outside the city, a quiet getaway spot they had discovered the previous summer. Vanessa packed a cooler with sandwiches and fruit, while Marcus loaded up the car with folding chairs, sunscreen, and Liana's favorite inflatable duck. The day unfolded with sunlit perfection. They swam, ate by the water, and watched dragonflies dance above the reeds. As the evening fell and shadows lengthened over the trees, they started their journey home. Marcus drove while Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, tired but content, her hand resting on her thigh. Liana, exhausted from the day, had fallen asleep in her booster seat, clutching a stuffed elephant she never left behind. The road they followed was quiet and winding, a rural stretch with few streetlights and long patches of silence between passing cars. The hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional chirp of night insects filled the cabin. Vanessa leaned her head back and closed her eyes. It was peaceful. Until the peace shattered. A truck appeared without warning, its headlights cutting through the darkness, swerving erratically into their lane. Marcus reacted on instinct, jerking the wheel to avoid a head-on collision. The car spun, tires screeching against the pavement, metal groaning as control slipped away. Time fractured into fragments. Vanessa's body snapped against her seatbelt. Glass burst. Steel folded. The world became a chaos of noise, weightlessness, and terror. The sound of Liana's small body being thrown, even within the constraints of her seat, echoed in the air like a bell tolling the end of everything. When the car finally stopped, crushed and smoking against the base of a tree, the silence was worse than the crash. Vanessa woke first, disoriented, her vision blurred and blood trickling down her temple. She turned to Marcus, unconscious, slumped forward. His forehead was bleeding, and his leg appeared unnaturally bent. Panic clutched her chest as she turned toward the back seat. Liana didn't move. She was still, too still. Her head lolled, her eyes half open. The elephant lay on the floor. In those seconds, Vanessa felt her entire soul crack. The scream never fully formed in her throat. She reached, touched, pleaded without words. But it was too late. Liana was gone. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but time no longer mattered. They declared the child dead at the scene. Marcus, unresponsive and bleeding internally, was rushed to the hospital. Vanessa, despite her injuries, refused treatment at first. She sat in the emergency room with Liana's blood still on her hands, staring at nothing, deaf to everything around her. Marcus spent the next 3 months in the hospital. Multiple surgeries to repair shattered bones, physical therapy to help him walk again, and a haze of painkillers dulled both his body and his grief. Vanessa visited him, but never stayed long. She brought books, clean clothes, sometimes sat silently in the corner of the room while nurses checked his vitals. But she rarely met his eyes. The accident was never discussed aloud. The room was too full of what had been lost. When Marcus finally returned home, he did so with a cane and a hollow expression. The house was different. Liana's room remained untouched. Her drawing still clung to the fridge, her toothbrush still waited beside the sink. Vanessa refused to pack any of it away. The silence in the house became unbearable. What once echoed with laughter now pulsed with quiet sorrow. The clocks ticked louder. The floorboards creaked in long, lonely intervals. They passed each other in the hallway like strangers in mourning. Vanessa went back to work weeks later, diving into her clinic with a rigid focus. She buried herself in lab results, test tubes, patient files. The sterile world of medicine offered a refuge where grief could be controlled, reduced to symptoms and schedules. Marcus tried to return to his business, but everything felt alien. The shop, the tools, even the smell of oil and metal, all reminders of the life before the crash. He stood behind the counter most days, doing nothing. They never spoke about the accident in depth. It hung between them like a thick, invisible curtain. Sometimes at night, Vanessa would sit in the living room, staring at Liana's last drawing, a family portrait with crooked smiles and blue skies. Marcus, unable to sleep, would lie in their bed alone, listening for footsteps that would never return. Though they shared a home, they existed in different worlds of pain. Vanessa's was rigid, silent, restrained. Marcus's was blurred, full of guilt and confusion. He replayed the moment of the crash over and over in his mind, wondering if there was something, anything, he could have done differently. The memory haunted him, the steering wheel jerking, the scream he couldn't stop, the weight of his daughter's silence. And in Vanessa's heart, forgiveness did not take root. No matter how much she told herself it was an accident, a cruel twist of fate, something inside her pointed to Marcus. He had been behind the wheel. He had taken them down that road. She tried to suppress the resentment, but it seeped into her blood like a slow poison. Grief turned to distance. Distance became ice. Their once bright home dimmed into a place where loss lived in every corner. And though neither of them said it aloud, something essential between them had broken beyond repair that night, a single moment on a dark road that divided their lives into before and after, love and silence, joy and something unnameable. By the autumn of 2013, the Hunter household had become a quiet monument to grief. The laughter that once floated through its halls had faded into long, echoing silences. The spaces that once held warmth now felt cold and suspended in time. Marcus had begun walking without the cane, but the heaviness in his gait remained, like a weight that extended far beyond his injuries. Vanessa, outwardly composed, moved through each day like a machine. Her routine was precise, her tone even, her eyes dull. Grief had not made her dramatic, it had made her distant. They lived together, but no longer lived with each other. Meals were consumed in silence. Shared glances were rare and empty. The warmth of physical closeness had evaporated. Nights passed with Marcus sleeping on the far edge of the bed, while Vanessa often found herself waking on the couch, unable to bear the shared space. Conversations had grown brief and functional, never touching the pain that hovered just beneath the surface. And yet, neither of them gave up entirely. They recognized, even in their numbness, that they were unraveling. One evening, Vanessa suggested therapy, not with emotion, but with the flat, tired voice of someone checking an item off a list. Marcus agreed. Not because he believed it would help, but because he didn't know what else to do. They had tried avoidance, silence, endurance, and none of it brought relief. Perhaps this, at least, would offer a thread to hold. Their sessions began with awkward stiffness. The therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Elaine, asked simple questions that stirred uncomfortable truths. Vanessa answered with intellectual detachment, her words polished and carefully chosen. Marcus stumbled through his responses, emotional but guarded. Progress was slow. Trust came in small pieces. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, only fragments, shared memories, silent tears, clenched hands. Dr. Elaine was patient. She saw that beneath their pain was a shared desire to heal, though neither knew how. She challenged them to be present with their grief rather than burying it. She asked Vanessa to name her anger without guilt. She encouraged Marcus to confront his shame without collapsing under it. There were moments, brief, flickering, when something like connection resurfaced. A hand that lingered too long on a coffee cup. A sigh that matched the others. A glance that, for just a moment, didn't look away. After several months, Dr. Elaine suggested something different. A new tactic. She explained that grief had isolated Vanessa in a place even Marcus couldn't reach. That sometimes, reconnecting with someone from one's past, someone outside the immediate grief, could open a different kind of door. She recommended inviting a trusted person to stay with them, to help lighten the emotional load and bring fresh energy into the home. Vanessa didn't react at first. She simply nodded. But later, in the parking lot, Marcus hesitated before speaking. He reminded her about her younger sister, Tiffany, who had mentioned months earlier that she planned to apply to college in Savannah. Maybe they could invite her for a short visit. The idea was practical. She was family. She would have her own goals, her own life. But maybe, just maybe, she could be the bridge Vanessa needed. Vanessa said nothing for a long moment, then gave a small nod. It wasn't approval. It wasn't excitement. But it was enough. Tiffany had always been a part of their world, though from a distance. Much younger than Vanessa, she had grown up in another city, but the sisters had remained close over the years. Vanessa often spoke of her with a kind of maternal affection, proud, protective, occasionally exasperated. Marcus had met her a few times over the course of their marriage. Bright, charming, and strikingly beautiful, Tiffany had always seemed to float through life with ease. She had a way of making people feel important, a smile that lingered in the air after she left the room. But Marcus had never looked at her more than as a distant relative by marriage, a much younger sibling of the woman he loved. He made the call. Tiffany was eager. She had already been accepted to a college in the city and had been planning a move anyway. This invitation simply accelerated the timeline. She arrived 2 weeks later with 2 suitcases, a laptop, and an energy that immediately stood in contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the house. The first few days were strange. Tiffany was respectful, tiptoeing around Vanessa's grief, keeping conversations light. She helped in the kitchen, cleaned without being asked, and made gentle jokes that pulled small smiles from Marcus. Vanessa remained guarded, but something in her began to shift. It wasn't joy. But it was a kind of softening, a loosening of the iron grip she had kept on her own pain. Watching her little sister move through the kitchen, hearing the television playing something other than silence, having another voice in the house, it all brought an illusion of normalcy. Tiffany made it a point to engage Vanessa in small ways. They went on walks together. They sat in the backyard and watched the trees move. Vanessa, for the first time in months, found herself laughing, softly, briefly, but genuinely. She still didn't look Marcus in the eyes, but she began to look at herself in the mirror again. She started brushing her hair with care, eating full meals, and sleeping longer. To an outside observer, it might have appeared as though things were finally healing. There was motion again. Not fast, not bright, but motion nonetheless. Vanessa spoke more in therapy. Marcus stopped drinking late into the night. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. Even if the loss remained, it was no longer the only presence in the room. But beneath this fragile progress, a subtle tension had begun to build. A current that neither of them recognized yet. Hope, when built on cracked ground, has a way of trembling beneath the surface. And in their quiet desperation to find light, neither Vanessa nor Marcus noticed a shadow beginning to take shape just behind it. Tiffany's arrival brought with it a curious blend of comfort and disruption. At 20 years old, she was in many ways the opposite of her older sister. Where Vanessa was composed, precise, and deeply introspective, Tiffany had always been spontaneous, expressive, and full of vibrant, almost theatrical charm. She entered the Hunter household like a warm breeze, light, chatty, and radiant in a way that made people smile without knowing why. But beneath her sweet demeanor and polite gestures was a more complicated interior, one carefully concealed behind charm and practiced innocence. As a child, Tiffany had adored Vanessa. Their age gap made Vanessa less of a sibling and more of a distant idol, someone Tiffany admired, copied, and yearned to be like. Vanessa had been the golden girl, straight-A student, science competitions, scholarships, graceful, admired by relatives and neighbors alike. Tiffany, in contrast, had always been the wild card, lively and unpredictable, clever but unfocused, more concerned with being adored than achieving. Growing up, she had watched her sister from the doorway of their shared life, half loving, half envying her. Even then, she knew she could never compete with Vanessa's brilliance, so instead she perfected her likability. She learned how to perform affection, how to charm adults, how to be seen without being scrutinized. When Vanessa married Marcus, Tiffany was still a teenager. She remembered watching the wedding from the front row in a peach-colored dress, her eyes fixated on the man her sister was marrying. Marcus was handsome, self-assured, and grounded in a way that exuded both strength and warmth. He had looked at Vanessa with reverence, and Tiffany had quietly imagined what it might feel like to be on the receiving end of that gaze. She never voiced her thoughts, never acted on them. But a seed was planted, a desire not for Marcus himself, but for the life her sister had built. The house, the career, the adoring husband, the stability. It was everything Tiffany had never been able to hold in her own life. Now, years later, she found herself living under their roof. The invitation had seemed like an opportunity, a second chance to begin again, to escape the chaotic patterns of her past. Her college acceptance had been a rare success in a string of half-finished efforts. She arrived in Savannah with gratitude in her tone and well-rehearsed humility. She thanked Vanessa and Marcus repeatedly, unpacked her things neatly in the guest room, and kept her presence unobtrusive for a while. At first, she fulfilled exactly the role expected of her. She cooked dinner on some nights, cleaned the kitchen without being asked, ran errands, and accompanied Vanessa on errands to the store. Her laughter filled the spaces where silence had once reigned, and Marcus noticed how the atmosphere in the house shifted with her presence. Vanessa, though still reserved, began to show small signs of renewal. She talked more. She sat at the dinner table longer. She walked more slowly past Liana's room instead of rushing by with her eyes averted. Tiffany took note of it all. She noticed the way her sister's eyes still looked hollow when no one was watching. She noticed the quiet restraint between Vanessa and Marcus, the lack of touch, the absence of glances. And though she never said it aloud, she began to imagine herself fitting into the empty spaces they had both tried so hard to ignore. The thing about Tiffany was that she never acted impulsively, not when it came to things she truly wanted. Her spontaneity was a mask, a distraction from the calculations that always churned beneath the surface. She had spent years studying her sister, her grace, her discipline, the way people respected her, and Tiffany had long ago realized that she couldn't be Vanessa. But maybe, just maybe, she could inherit the life Vanessa seemed no longer able to hold. It began innocently enough. A shared joke with Marcus in the hallway. A hand resting a second too long on his arm. A compliment about his cooking, his work, his resilience. Marcus, starved for affection and closeness, didn't see the cues for what they were. He felt gratitude, maybe even fondness. She was helping Vanessa, helping him. She made him laugh when he didn't remember how. She made him feel seen again. And Tiffany noticed every flicker of response in his expression. But she never rushed. She was patient. She spent her time tending to both of them, but always with a slightly brighter smile for Marcus, always a little more attention to his needs. She filled his coffee cup without asking, folded his shirts when no one asked her to, sat beside him on the couch during family movies. Vanessa rarely joined them, too exhausted, too emotionally distant. And so Tiffany quietly stepped into the space left behind. She never spoke ill of her sister. On the contrary, she praised her constantly. How strong Vanessa was, how inspiring. But in private moments, when Marcus was weary and uncertain, Tiffany became the voice of comfort. Soft words. Subtle validation. The kind that slowly built trust. She asked about his work, his injuries, his memories. She offered empathy without pity, admiration without pressure. Marcus, whose heart was heavy with guilt and loneliness, began to look forward to those small moments of connection. He didn't recognize the danger. He didn't see how close she was stepping to the line. Meanwhile, Vanessa began to relax, believing that Tiffany's presence was helping in the way the therapist had hoped. She saw the lightness in Marcus's step, the occasional smile, the lessening of tension in his shoulders. It never occurred to her that Tiffany could be anything but sincere. She had loved her sister too long, too deeply, to imagine betrayal. Tiffany had always been dramatic, emotional, but not dangerous. Not calculated. Not the kind of girl who would destroy what little was left of a broken home. And so, for a time, the fragile hope lived on. Vanessa allowed herself to believe in progress. Marcus allowed himself to feel companionship again. And Tiffany, always smiling, always helpful, waited quietly in the wings of the life she had once only dreamed about. Step by step, she moved closer to the center of the stage, ready for a role she had never been given, but had always secretly rehearsed. It began with a glance, one that lasted a moment too long, exchanged in the quiet of the kitchen while Vanessa was upstairs folding laundry. Marcus had turned to thank Tiffany for preparing dinner, and their eyes met across the countertop. Something in the silence held a weight neither of them acknowledged. From that moment forward, the boundary between them began to shift, slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with growing certainty. Marcus had been adrift in his marriage for months. Since the accident, Vanessa had become emotionally unreachable, locked behind a wall of silent grief and unspoken blame. Their interactions had grown mechanical. He still loved her, but he no longer recognized her. Touch had vanished, affection had disappeared, and every effort to reach her felt like a futile knock on a closed door. So when Tiffany entered his life with warmth, attention, and a softness that felt almost intoxicating, it was as if he had stumbled upon something he had forgotten he needed. Tiffany, for her part, knew exactly what she was doing. Every gesture was intentional, the way she leaned in when she spoke to him, the way she let her hand brush his when passing him a plate, the way she complimented him with just the right balance of admiration and subtle flirtation. She had studied him, learned his routines, his moments of vulnerability. She waited for Vanessa to leave the room before she smiled more openly, spoke more gently. And Marcus responded, not with intent, but with longing for connection, for warmth, for something that didn't ache. Their first real crossing of the line was as quiet as it was inevitable. It happened one evening in the living room, while Vanessa was working late at the clinic. They sat too close on the couch, watched a film neither was really paying attention to. Tiffany rested her head lightly on Marcus's shoulder, feigning fatigue. He didn't move away. His hand found hers. They sat like that for minutes, unmoving, as the screen flickered in front of them and the silence in the house wrapped around them like complicity. What followed was not explosive but gradual. Stolen moments. Late-night conversations in the kitchen. Lingering touches during household chores. Whispers exchanged behind closed doors. Each interaction layered over the last until the line between harmless and dangerous no longer existed. They became secret keepers, caught in a web of guilt and desire. And all the while, Vanessa remained unaware, her trust in both of them intact, unbroken. Marcus lived in a growing state of conflict. Every encounter with Tiffany brought temporary relief followed by waves of guilt. He told himself it wasn't serious, that it would stop. But it didn't. The loneliness he had lived with for so long made the deception feel almost justified. Tiffany offered what Vanessa had taken away. In her presence, he felt needed again, wanted, even admired. It dulled the edge of his guilt just enough for him to keep going. Tiffany, emboldened by Marcus's receptiveness, allowed her feelings to deepen. What began as envy and manipulation transformed into something more dangerous, attachment. She convinced herself it was love. She told herself that she was the one who understood him now, the one who healed him when his own wife had turned cold. She began to fantasize about permanence, imagining a life where she was no longer the guest in her sister's home, but the woman at Marcus's side. They took greater risks. They met in his office, behind the locked garage door. They exchanged messages on hidden phones. Marcus became paranoid but couldn't pull away. He felt trapped, not just by his guilt, but by the secret that now defined every part of his day. Every time Vanessa asked how his day was, he felt a tightness in his chest. Every time Tiffany smiled at her sister across the dinner table, he felt the walls closing in. Vanessa began to notice small things. Marcus was more distracted than usual. Tiffany spent more time around him than made sense. There were moments when the two of them would exchange glances that didn't belong between in-laws. At first, she dismissed the unease as paranoia, a side effect of grief and exhaustion. But unease became suspicion when she noticed her phone missing from the kitchen counter one morning and then reappearing in a different place. She began to observe more closely. One day, While folding Tiffany's laundry, Vanessa saw something she couldn't unsee, a message notification from Marcus, lighting up the screen of Tiffany's phone. She didn't read the full message. She didn't have to. The tone, the familiarity, the private timestamp, it was enough. Her body went cold. Her hands shook. And something inside her began to fracture anew. She said nothing. Not immediately. Instead, she waited. She watched. She checked call logs, noted strange absences, tracked behavior. The pattern was unmistakable. Marcus would leave the house and Tiffany would disappear a few minutes later. Their shared smiles, their nervous energy when in the same room, all painted a picture of betrayal she could no longer deny. The realization was suffocating. The two people she trusted most in the world had conspired against her, not in violence, but in secrecy. And that betrayal, layered atop the already unbearable weight of her daughter's death, became something else entirely, something darker. Vanessa sat in her daughter's empty bedroom that night, surrounded by toys untouched for months, and let the silence swallow her. In her heart, she relived the crash, the funeral, the therapy sessions, the fragile attempts to breathe through pain. And now this. Her husband and her sister had taken what little remained of her life and corrupted it. The devastation was total, a hollowing of the soul. There were no tears. Only a cold, numb silence, and the flicker of something new, a desire not for healing, but for justice. Or revenge. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a stage of deceit. Vanessa knew the truth now. She saw it clearly in the way they avoided her gaze, in the two casual conversations, and the falseness of their concern. Her grief, once buried under years of trying to forgive and move forward, now surfaced with a new companion, rage. And quietly, methodically, she began to consider what it meant to be powerless no longer. Vanessa had always been calm, precise, and measured, traits that had made her a respected physician, a devoted mother, a loving wife. But as she sat alone in her office after hours, the silence around her humming like static, those same traits took on a different quality. They became the foundation of something far more unsettling. Her betrayal was not loud. It did not erupt. It calcified inside her, grew roots in the darkest corners of her soul, and formed a quiet, methodical plan. She reviewed everything in her mind over and over. The accident. The way Marcus had driven them into that tree. The sound of Liana's small body breaking inside that car. The emptiness that followed. The slow unraveling of their marriage. Then Tiffany's arrival, her bright eyes, her sympathetic smile, her poison cloaked in sweetness. Vanessa had watched the affair unfold like a slow, cruel theater production in which she had been cast as the oblivious wife. But she wasn't oblivious anymore. She had seen it all, the texts, the glances, the absences. And now, with all the pieces laid bare before her, she made a decision. Not from emotion, not from rage, but from a deeper place, a belief that justice, long denied, needed to be restored by her hand. It was late November when she began preparing. Her clinic had access to many things: medications, sterile equipment, controlled substances, and most importantly, blood samples. She thought long and hard before choosing the sample. It came from a man in his 40s, recently diagnosed with advanced HIV, whose blood had been collected for initial viral load testing. She noted the code, retrieved the vial from cold storage, and placed it among her personal effects without a tremor in her hand. That evening, she drove home with the virus tucked neatly beside a sealed syringe labeled B12. Marcus had been due for another round of immune support, a therapy Vanessa had prescribed post-accident as part of his recovery regimen. For months, she had administered vitamin B12 injections every few weeks under the pretense of supporting his nervous system. He never questioned it. Not once. He sat on the couch, turned his arm, and trusted her. And on that particular night, he did the same. She sterilized the site, opened the syringe, and slid the needle beneath his skin. Her expression was neutral, her touch clinical. When it was done, he smiled, thanked her, and reached for the television remote. Vanessa watched him without a word, then turned and left the room. The effects weren't immediate. Days passed. Weeks. Marcus started feeling ill. At first, it resembled the flu. Fatigue, fever, body aches. Then came the night sweats, the persistent cough, the unexplained weight loss. Vanessa feigned concern. She took his temperature, offered vague suggestions about seasonal viruses, and referred him to another physician for lab work. When the results came back, the truth shattered what little remained of his world. Marcus was HIV positive. The diagnosis hit him like a second collision. He was in disbelief. Confused. Ashamed. He couldn't understand how this had happened. There had only been one partner besides his wife. His thoughts spiraled. He confronted Tiffany, wild with panic. She denied everything, but he saw it as confirmation. In his mind, she had infected him, carelessly, recklessly. His shame turned to fury. Their next argument was explosive. The confrontation took place on the second floor of the house. Marcus yelled, accused her of being promiscuous, irresponsible, dangerous. Tiffany, cornered and terrified, shouted back. Vanessa, listening from downstairs, heard the escalation in voices. Then came a crash, flesh against wood, the sound of a body tumbling. She ran up the stairs just as Tiffany landed at the bottom, her body twisted unnaturally, blood seeping from her mouth. She was alive, but barely. The hospital report confirmed spinal trauma. Tiffany would never walk again. The HIV test confirmed a second truth: she was now positive. Whether she had been before the fall or contracted it through Marcus, no one would ever know for certain. The doctors didn't ask. The police did. Vanessa sat by Tiffany's hospital bed for an hour, holding her sister's cold hand. Then she left and walked directly into the nearest police precinct. She requested to speak with a detective. Calmly, deliberately, she explained everything: the affair, the betrayal, the stolen future of her daughter, and finally, what she had done. She described in detail how she had substituted the vitamin injection with infected blood. She handed over documentation, serial numbers, logs from her clinic. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She told the truth as if reading it from a chart. The arrest was swift. Marcus, still weak from illness, was taken into custody and charged not only with domestic violence resulting in permanent injury, but with criminal transmission of a communicable disease. The court proceedings were a spectacle. News of the case spread throughout Savannah like wildfire. Neighbors who once admired the Hunter family now whispered with morbid fascination. Journalists gathered outside the courthouse. Vanessa became both villain and victim in the eyes of the public. Marcus pleaded guilty to the assault but denied knowledge of the injection. Tiffany sat in her wheelchair in the front row of the courtroom, silent, hollow-eyed. Vanessa was sentenced for aggravated assault and unlawful medical conduct. She did not fight it. She accepted her time in prison as payment. Not just for what she had done, but for everything she had endured. Tiffany's life would never return to what it had been. Bound to a chair, infected, abandoned by both family and hope, she lived in quiet isolation, surviving on government aid and supervised care. Marcus, too, was broken, a once proud man now ill, disgraced, imprisoned. The life he had tried to rebuild after the crash had collapsed under the weight of his own betrayal. The house on Willow Drive remained empty for years, a shuttered shell of the life it once contained. The neighbors stopped looking at it. The paint peeled. The yard grew wild. No one mowed the grass anymore. And in the heart of Savannah, the story of the Hunters lived on as a whispered warning of how easily love can decay, how quickly trust can corrode, and how sometimes the deepest wounds are not the ones we see, but the ones we quietly inject into each other, one drop at a time.